I'm Dr. Vanessa Sinclair, and this is Rendering Unconscious. My guest today is Dr. Dwight Turner, a psychotherapist and supervisor working in private practice in London and online. He's a senior lecturer in psychodynamic counseling and psychotherapy training at the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Brighton in East Sussex. His new book is Mockingbird: Intersections of Privilege and Otherness in Counseling and Psychotherapy. For more, please visit his website, dwightturnercounseling.co.uk, and follow him on Instagram and Twitter at dturner300. That's DTURNER 300 at Twitter and Instagram. As with all Rendering Unconscious podcast episodes, there is a video accompanying this episode at YouTube. Just visit Trapart Film's YouTube channel. That's TRAPART Film at YouTube, or search for Rendering Unconscious podcast. Links to everything can be found in the text accompanying this episode. You can visit my website, drvanessasinclair.net, or the podcast's main website, renderingunconscious.org, for links and more information. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram at rawsin_. That's RAWSIN_. Rendering Unconscious is also a book, Rendering Unconscious: Psychoanalytic Perspectives, Politics, and Poetry, from Trapart Books 2019. For more information, you can visit our publisher's website, trapart.net. That's TRAPART.net. You can support the podcast at our Patreon, patreon.com/Vanessa23Carl. That's VANESSA 23CARL. Your support is very appreciated. Thank you so much for supporting Rendering Unconscious podcast and all of my other creative endeavors. Well, thank you for being here, Dr. Turner. I love your book. Thank you for writing this book.
Thank you for reading it. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh. One thing that's really different about this book than a lot of other books out there that I found is that, first of all, you talk a lot about personal experiences, which really makes it like more interesting to read, I feel, and also like clinical vignettes. It like brings it into like the realm of working with actual people, your personal experience, and not just feeling like a theoretical work. And it's also written in such an accessible way. So I feel like you don't have to be in the field to read it and really get something out of it. And it really could teach people that are just learning or aren't in the field of psychology. They could get a lot out of it. And also just the fact that it brings it into the field of psychology. So it brings issues into the field of like working with patients, but also training as a psychologist or a therapist. And the changes that need to be made in the training basically bring some aspects to light.
Well, those are all done. Yeah, you spot those very well, because all four of those are key pillars. I was trying to aim to get all those in. You know, this part of my research was heuristic, so my own experience would have been on the page on my doctoral thesis when I finished that back in 2017. And I wanted to include parts of that in this book as well, because I'm, you know, as a man of color, son of an immigrant living in the UK, you know, my experience of being an outsider is massive. So why leave that on the outside? And that's something that often as writers or as theorists or researchers, we can be accused of. Okay, where's the personal experience and what's happened there that gets left out somewhere? Making things accessible is the thing about academia, and you understand as well as I do, is that sometimes in making things very wordy, using long words and stuff like that, it can become quite exclusive. So the aim was always to to write in a way that was both professional, but also accessible. And even that meant I had to explain a few bits of terminology along the way. The reason why I've written things in a more, in an accessible way is so that it does cross over into the world. You know, people can read it if they're just lay people off the street. I want to understand, okay, how does psychotherapy approach this sort of material? What are the unconscious processes? Maybe they've done some work around spirituality or whatever else, and they want to look at, okay, what is that? What might their dreams mean when they're exploring this material? That's what makes this book quite strong, so that they can read it too. It's not just for professionals.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also love that you bring together, which I also hadn't seen before, intersectionality in Kimberly Crenshaw's work, and then individuation in the Jungian sense, you know?
Yeah, yeah, yes. You have no idea how hard that was to actually try and do, because you're talking about the well, in a bizarre way. It's always psychotherapy, but well, yeah, I'm the one having to do it. So it's probably it's not that we haven't done it before, so that I'm the one having to tie these things together. Because even within psychotherapy, there were, you know, things like family systems therapy and so on, and John Rowan's work around subpersonalities. We've always explored ideas of having multiple personalities within ourselves. Now, to bring in an intersectional approach, which, as Audre Lorde says, we don't lead single issue lives. So she recognizes there that we're actually a multiple of personalities there as well. Those two ideas are not that far apart. It just took for somebody with a lot of time on his hands, like myself, to actually create that bridge between the two worlds. And I love the fact that intersectionality makes difference and diversity and privilege and otherness complicated, but also richer and more inclusive accordingly. We're actually hopefully this book starts to help readers to approach their identities in a more holistic way. They're not just one or two key aspects as defined by the patriarchy or as defined by their race or gender or sexuality. We're a complex composite of very different parts and which all interact together. That's what these two worlds actually bring up in the book.
Yeah, absolutely. And also it brings up, like, depending on situations, like your place of identity, your privilege or otherness is like in
Yeah.
flux constantly, depending on the situation that you're in and who's projecting onto you, or those sort of things.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, how I am at home with my daughter, for example, is going to be vastly different to how I am when I'm at work amongst my students. It's going to be vastly different to when I'm out walking through the streets of Eastbourne. It could even be, you know, if I'm in Eastbourne, I'm okay. It's not a very multicultural town, for where I am in the south of England, I should say. But if I move just like half an hour to the west towards Brighton, there's a lot more diversity there. So therefore, how I'm seen it's vastly different. So the parts of my identity which might shine through are going to be very different from just through that movement from one city to another. We go through this change all the time, and sometimes the need to project onto another, they are this, is more about our own discomfort with constantly encountering difference than it is with the fact that that's who they are. We underestimate, in my view, the anxiety that comes up when we encounter something which is unusual to us or that we don't quite understand. And stereotyping on objectification and othering, term I use a lot in the book, are actually ways of trying to avoid that discomfort, if you like, and make that other. It's like we don't like to sit with not knowing, so to speak, and that includes other people too.
Yeah, absolutely. And also you point out that, like, human subjectivity is in part like based on this sort of othering of like defining ourselves on what we are not from when we're the time of really little children.
Yeah, totally. You know, the idea about an intersectional approach, you know, there are three key tenets that Patricia Hills Collins talks about: race, gender, and class. Actually, if she locates those three, and these are all, at least in part, socially constructed. So the idea about you know, whiteness or blackness being defined by whiteness is which it shows that actually this is a culturally created sort of idea of identity versus another. De Beauvoir wrote about this with regards to gender, where she wrote a lot about how the sociological aspects of what it was to be a man and what it was not to be a man, therefore define what it was to be a woman. So anything that was not seen as masculine was then deemed to be feminine in a way. These are hugely, they're very well embedded, these ideas within culture, but they're also hugely flawed because they don't allow oneself to actually be way more than than the actual definitions. You know, we see it a lot with ideas around toxic masculinity, for example. The idea that you've got to be a certain way to be a man. You can't embody characteristics which are seen as more feminine, because if that's the case, then you're seen as weak. Or ideas about what it is to be of color, versus, okay, can one then be successful as a man of color? If you're seen as successful, then you're seen as maybe you're too white, or you're playing up in some way, and vice versa. These constructs become quite limiting and in some ways self-othering. So that social aspect needs to be in the book as well, as a form of exploration.
Yeah, exactly. And I feel like in therapy, a lot of times, or analysis, a lot of times people have to go through a process of breaking down these kinds of ideas or constructs that have been placed upon them, that they've internalized and like learned to identify with. But then they're like, wait, maybe I don't really feel that way about myself, or I don't really identify with that. But it just became kind of second nature, but it wasn't even questioned for such a long time.
But you're making a great point there. It becomes second nature because they come in so early on in life. You mentioned children earlier on. You know, a child from a working class background will have taken in what it is to be working class from the moment he's probably starting to walk and start to become socialized in the world. So we walk with that to then separate out from that. This is why I think individuation becomes quite important. That inner drive to be more than one's conditioning. That makes sense. That inner drive, for example, if we look at class, so from a working class background, be able to find one's voice as a working class man and not feel silenced in society. That's a massive step that lots of people finally have to go through. And I know I did it as well. So being able to write the book, for example, or give talks, whatever else, has been a huge learning curve for myself in finding my voice and saying what I need to say and not feeling ashamed of that in some way. So moving beyond my conditioning where I was silenced and had to sit in the corner and just be the good working class son of an immigrant, black boy, whatever it might be, in a way. So I think you're right. Sometimes as therapists, we work a lot with that part of the client that wants to be more than just these categorizations that they've been told to be, in a way. It can be quite powerful.
Absolutely. And even as a professional, I found like reading you talking more about your personal experiences helping me feel more comfortable talk about it as well. Because
Mm-hmm.
doing this podcast, for example, I get really like, ugh, what have I revealed about myself, But there's also this kind of internalized shame. Like my father's a construction worker, and it's like, when you get into these spaces, they other people, and like of course I know it's much more for people, like I've had students of color, Black students come
Mm-hmm.
on and talk about like how hard it is to be in these psychological spaces. But that's the thing with like what the British have done, for example. You're kind of in the belly of the beast there. Like they othered
Yeah,
the
yeah.
Irish right next door, and the Irish people have lost their language. It's like they're
Mm-hmm.
very much into the different accents within England, right? And like
Mm.
what your accent says about you, about where you're from. And it's like it's done to such a degree, it's just like kind of endless.
I think it's it's very well put. The more posh your accent and the more accepted you are. So if you have any sort of slang or you talk like from the East End or from Northern England, that's before we even get to an Irish or Welsh or Scottish sort of accent, then you're seen as some sort of outsider in those ways. So everything rotates around one idea about what it is to be, in this case, English, or what it is to be, I suppose, American. That would probably be similar examples there as well. Um, Class has a huge role to play in a lot of this. You mentioned your dad being a construction worker. Mine was a black cab driver for a number of years when I was a kid. So, and he did it. He worked very hard. He provided and so on. He did what he needed to do. But moving from having to hold the internalized shame of having a black cab driver as a father, and also I was sent to a fee-paying school in London that was pretty well off. I'm going to do this on your podcast, I suppose. I won't name the school, but one of the pupils that went to the school was a famous actor, one of those sort of posh English actors that then ended up in many of those romantic comedies of the 1980s and 90s, that sort of person. So I went to a pretty decent school, but I struggled because I came from a different background to many other people there. And it was very difficult to find my feet and find my voice when I wasn't really accepted, not just because of my color, but because of my class as well, being sort of an immigrant. And that's something I've often struggled with an awful lot. Even when I write blogs now, I have a a core selection of friends, good friends who I actually run these blogs by every now and again. So am I revealing too much? Because I'm not sure if I'm going too far. Whereas they're saying, okay, who's this for? Yes, it touches a nerve for people, publish it. So then I end up doing so. But I have to go through a real process of what's the right amount of myself to show. Whereas lots of other people don't have to do that. They just write what they're going to write, put it on the page, and it's all well and good. The proof of the pudding for myself is when I've written something and somebody comes back and says, thank you for that. That really resonated for me. Then I know I'm on the right sort of level. If that makes sense. But it's a whole learned process of disentangling myself from the silencing that goes with being of a lower class, within that sort of lower class structure.
Yeah, and I remember when I was in psychoanalytic training, I was working in a hospital during the day and then had the private practice in the evening and psychoanalytic classes at night. And, one of my supervisors was basically like, well, why are you still working in this hospital? And I was like, because I need a paycheck.
Yeah,
like, what do you mean? Why am I still working? And she actually said, I remember she said, oh, so you're actually dependent on your paycheck. And I was like, who's not dependent on their paycheck? And then that's just when I had this realization of like what world I was in. It's like, what
yeah.
world am I in that someone is not dependent on their paycheck? That's like, I don't even know.
Oh, I feel for you. I totally empathize with you. Yeah, same as yourself. I used to work for 5 days and sometimes had to do courses on a weekend and had no social life because I was so busy working and studying at some point. And it does give you it gave me a different take on when I finished, like yourself, I then had to make money for what I was doing. So I worked for charities and stuff like that and then set up a private practice. But it gave me some work ethic around being a therapist, which I don't think I would have had if I'd have come from a certain type of privilege. It doesn't always work that way, but I don't think I would have had it the same sort of way. I think I had to go through that struggle to make it, to end up where I am now, put it that way. But yeah, I remember those days well. Painful, long hours sat on trains, going through London, all over the place. It's, oh,
Don't miss it.
I don't miss it. From London to move to the south coast, where I'm by the sea, and just sit and just watch the world go by. I've done my bit, but then I can empathize with anybody who's still going through that, be it psychology trainings or psychotherapy trainings. I get it. It's hard work, and actually, in a way, the courses don't recognize how difficult it can be for some students to actually have to, what they're giving up along the way to actually make this work. And everybody's cup of suffering is different. There's no right or wrong with it, but the struggles of some people who are from marginalized groups, I think get ignored in a way that perhaps for others it's not the same. So, the working classes, what are they having to go through to get to this level that we're at now, for example?
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I think, of course, becoming a therapist, I'm used to I'm comfortable not revealing much about myself and just listening, focusing on everyone else and being like, let me make you feel better. That's kind of how I formed defensively, I think. But like in revealing more, it's like, well, what's my goal here? My goal is to make these ideas more accessible to more people and to get out of those really like tiny elite communities, because I feel like it's such a disservice to psychoanalytic thinking to have them like holed up in these tiny places that most people don't access or don't have access to. And so I think I want to go back to more of a idea of like psychoanalysis for all, like Freud did after the First World War, when he saw like how much destruction there was and wanted it to like have more like free clinics and things like that. And so in order to do that, I think it's helpful for people to be able to relate and to share our experiences so that people can feel like not so alone in their journey.
I think it's very well put. There's not much more can add to that. I think you're quite right. Psychotherapy we've fallen into a bit of a trap in becoming exclusive and therefore separate to community, if you like, and they need our help. And I think you're quite right. The more that we can do in talking about our experience, doesn't matter what it is. I'm talking about it as a person of color, but there are plenty of people from the LGBTQ community, for example, who've read the book and really respect it, are talking about it with regards from their perspective. Doesn't matter what modality. They are. There are people, colleagues of mine who are in the TA sort of field, for example, who are exploring the book from within their sort of modality. They're exploring their stories based around this idea that we can talk about difference and privilege and otherness and where we're coming from, where we felt marginalized or put down or whatever it might be, in order that somebody else can actually then empathize with that and feel safe enough to actually explore that in work with us. You know, my clients, because they know that this is what I do, a lot of my clients will bring this material to the therapy room. Not all, but the vast majority do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also appreciate you brought in here in the book as well about how, it has been kind of a trope in psychology and psychoanalytic circles that you're not supposed to get political. And I
Oh,
think that's been such a disservice,
yeah.
period. It's like, yeah, because of course, like you said in the book as well, like some people don't have that option, and like also even if you do have that option, why would you take that stance? Because not saying anything is a stance in itself.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think because I wrote this book, well, this book has come out during the pandemic, but I finished writing it around the time the pandemic started. And I think the idea that we can't, that the political doesn't influence our clients is perhaps even more prevalent now with the pandemic, with George Floyd, with the rise to the continued fights for equal rights for different groups. To suggest that the political therefore doesn't have an impact on our client base is, in a way, it's re-traumatizing for so many different groups. You just have to look at the political fallout from the Sarah Everard murder and the vigils that were held afterwards here in the UK, and the Me Too movement in the US. These are things that clients will talk about or need some space to be able to explore within the therapeutic space. It's when we first met, I think it was around the time of the George Floyd murder, for example, that had huge political ramifications. Here in the UK, there was a report out earlier on this year denying the existence of institutional racism. And that's the number of clients I've had who, or even I've done it in my own therapy, talked about, okay, what is that like as a man of color who knows it exists, to then be led by a government who are denying the existence of something which is so embedded within white supremacy in British culture, people, English culture, to such an extent that actually it impacts on anybody who is not of the white British upper classes. It's a bit like a form of cultural gaslighting that we only have to go through, and that's going to have a detrimental psychological impact on the other. And that's explored in the book to some degree. To survive that, we have to kill off something within ourselves. To work through that is actually quite painful and difficult. How can one retain one's sense of authenticity whilst dealing with an environment whereby your experiences are denied from the very highest echelons of government?
Yeah, exactly. It's embedded in the systems. And yeah, I don't understand everything going on in the US because I don't get all the news here unless I like really seek it out. But I've been recently exploring critical race theory because I've heard this like explosion of like them not wanting to teach it in schools and not wanting to teach it. And I'm like, what is this argument about? And then from everything I've read, it's like, oh, they just don't want to teach the truth. They're saying they don't want to teach the truth about this.
Yeah, I think that's quite right. I think they don't want to teach the truth. And it's filtered over into the UK as well. And I think the thing about the report I just mentioned, it's called the Seeley report. The UN criticized it as a way of, what they were actually trying to do was actually promote white supremacy in the UK. So I think you're quite right. There's a denial of the truth. It's not, critical race theory is not there to denigrate a whole group of people. What it's there is to say that actually there's a bigger truth here, and here are these aspects, and actually not talking about these, then you are actually doing a hugely causing actually you're causing those people who are of the majority a lot of psychological pain because they don't know much of what they should know about their culture. They don't know about their true place in the world. You don't have to promote a system of supremacy in order to exist safely. That makes sense. You don't have to promote a system of exclusivity in order to survive. And yet that's what certain groups feel they need to do in order to dominate and therefore feel a sense of security.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know if you're familiar with Sheldon George's work, but he wrote a book that came out last year called Trauma and Race. And he talks about this as well. Like people's identity is so bound up on like what they are not or what they perceive. and that it feels like they're almost being annihilated when that's challenged, that they feel like they completely are like losing their sense of self, and they're so defensive about it and like terrified to even like look at themselves.
Well, this is why I think issues around race and gender and sexuality and even class need to be explored in a collective environment, because inevitably if we've all heard the stories. Okay, you have a workshop on, let's say, race, and somebody who's of color talks about their experiences, and somebody who's white then acts out in some sort of way. You're quite right. It's because of that. That's the white virginity phrase, although well put, I think doesn't go far enough. That sort of sense of annihilation, I think, speaks to it a lot more succinctly. In that, a sense of white identity is then fractured in that moment, or it's really challenged. But because these are binary constructs, then if one's able to explore them in a collective, then actually whatever challenge comes up from one side is held within the other as well, and vice versa. That makes sense. That none of this is anything new. Hegel talked about the master-slave sort of dialectic. Fanon looked at this as well. The idea is that actually to write this sort of pendulum, both parts need to either give and take something along the way. And identity is no different to that. Whatever's been projected from whiteness onto blackness, so that it can say that's what I'm not, needs to return home. And the same way for blackness. That makes sense. So the authority, the power that perhaps I have to divest myself of in order to exist safely has to return back to me. I'd even go even further than that. If I could use individuation, suggests that that part will come home whether I want it to or not. It will keep knocking on the door until I accept it. And that's where the power of dreams and the unconscious then comes into play to some degree.
Oh, I had to read this part because I this is one of those books where you have like so many parts underlined. It's just like this. But I was looking at this the other day again. It was so good. Psychological supremacy versus individuation. I think this is so good. Given the intersectional nature of identity, then it could appear that any route towards a true sense of self and authenticity is an impossible goal. This is why so many reject the call to action as positive in myths such as the hero's journey. The complexity and near impossibility of the task of individuation make it seem a most daunting route to follow. Yet, as many may question, does this mean that such a route towards individuation should not be undertaken? My answer is that we do not actually have a choice in the matter, that any question of this type is actually flawed. The self and its libidinous drives force us to constantly move towards being more real, and that process will inevitably result in us exploring our shadows and encountering the projections we have upon the external other. And you go on and talk about how like what's in the shadow is not the same for everyone as well. It depends on kind of what aspects have been sort of cut off or repressed.
Because I think what I like about that, I wrote this a while back, so I get to think about it in a bit more detail now. What I like about that sort of statement there is to follow on from what's in the shadow. You're quite right. It's not the same for everybody else, but there's still going to be archetypes at the end of that in the depths. Let's call it that. Let's use Jung's sort of terminology. But how we experience those archetypes becomes quite phenomenological. So the archetype of the hero will be experienced by different people in vastly different ways. I do believe that there's this innate drive towards individuation. It sits within all of us, and some of us will hear it, and some of us will deny it even exists. And we're drawn to a form of self-action to actually separate out from whatever conditioning we've had as we've walked through life. I think the struggle, maybe one that I don't write enough about, the struggle to get to that point is really one of the most important parts of it. It's not just about getting from A to B. It's about that place in between whereby it's difficult, it's painful. And individuation, as I talked about there, is often posited as something which is nice and fluffy. You explore your dreams, you do some psychological work, you get to the end of the rainbow, you live happily ever after. And yet, in my personal view, I think it's a very painful, difficult, strenuous process to go through that can lead to multiple processes or periods of breaking down to break through into something new. It's even if you just look at the notion of alchemy, as Jung talks about it, the ideas of alchemical processes. If you're forging using the metaphor, if you're forging a knife or a sword in the fires and in the waters of a what's his name? I can't remember what they're called, but if you're making that sort of instrument, there's a lot of pain and power and that one needs to go through in order to actually construct that implement to be able to use it better in life. It's not a nice fluffy process. We sort of have no choice in the matter, and we have to sort of walk that sort of path. And I also think on a collective level, it becomes even more pronounced how difficult it is to actually move along that road. You know, I've written about it in the book. 2012, for example, here in the UK, the Olympics, we were basking in this post-racial society, this idea that everything was now over with regards to race and difference. And then within 4 years, you've got the rise of nationalism, both in the States and the UK and then across Europe as well in different areas. And things then separate, they move backwards. And as Hegel talks about in his writing, culture doesn't move along a straight path. It will meander like a river as it winds its way down towards the sea. And sometimes in that meandering, it's painful, it's difficult. Psychotherapy, psychology, the routes towards individuation, personal and collective, they're challenging, but we have no choice.
Yeah, exactly. Because you got to do the work, but it is work. And that's the thing too, when people go into therapy thinking that they're going to like meditate and feel nice, all of a sudden it's really not that way. At least for a while. I remember my first like really good analysis. I would sit outside in my car for half an hour every day and cry after analysis before I could even get it together to drive my car home. I remember that. So
I can empathize. That journey to and from therapy for me in the early days was massive, as big as I'd actually been in the therapy itself. Because for me, I'd be writing in my diary. I'd sit in a cafe and write in my diary before I went into therapy, lots of tears, whatever else, and then cope. On my way home on the train, just write some more, just so I could formulate or just collect whatever I'd learned about myself during that session. And then then there are all the dreams that I write about, because in there it's like a small drop in the ocean of all the dreams that I have. I can literally dream 1 or 2 times a night if I'm not careful, which therefore means I don't always get as much sleep as I would like, to be honest, but that's a whole different conversation.
Well, I love that you bring your dreams in too. I watched you did a keynote, I guess last year or 2 years ago, and you talked about different dreams you had in your own process and kind of use examples in that way. And that was so nice to hear. And I love how you said, like, don't worry, these were not like all in the same week. This was like over a year, else it would have been really intense.
Sure. Yeah, well, yeah. But this is the thing, this is the beautiful thing about dreams and understanding that those we talked about archetypes and unconscious processes and stuff like that. And dreams, Jung talks about them, the royal road to the unconscious, and they are a wonderful way of exploring just what we're going through. And they will hold the split off parts of ourselves. So if we've had to conform to a way of being as a woman or as a man of color, whatever it happens to be, that atrophy part of ourself will sit there in the unconscious, waiting to be known in some way. It will always play itself out. I remember having a dream not so long ago whereby I was in Ireland, and I'm a dog, basically. I'm at a dog show. I am a dog at a dog show, basically. I'm waiting for somebody who's white and European or English, I think it was, to come and judge me and assess me as being appropriate for, I don't know, whatever it was. So I'm literally sitting there all day long. And I remember exploring this with my therapist, and of course, Ireland, and black, the Irish and black people, we have a very close sort of history here in the UK. We were all excluded. Was it no blacks, no Irish, no dogs? Was the signs that you'd find on doors of lodging houses and whatever else here in the UK back in the 50s and 60s. So that idea about marginalization is part of our collective history. It's also why the Irish and black people in the UK get on so well, to be honest, in this day and age. And it's, so that internalized cultural inferiority complex, maybe it's that, maybe it's not, that was playing itself out in the dream at that point, and it's something I had to work with and work through to actually pull out something more reparative, put it that way.
Yeah, that just got me thinking of dog shows in general, and what a weird thing that is.
What thinking about
dog shows in general, how weird that is, that people do that to people and dogs. So like put them.
They are strange, aren't they? I'm not. People watch Crufts like it's a very English thing, watching Crufts. I don't quite get it. I don't actually understand what the dogs are being assessed on or anything like that. So I just don't watch it. It's a bizarre thing. I feel like equestrianism. I don't quite understand it. It's one of those weird sort of, yeah, what's that all about? So
It's it's inbreeding. They inbreed the dogs, so they
mm,
basically make their traits, their recessive traits, more prominent, and it makes the dogs really weird. It doesn't
mm.
seem healthy.
No,
Doesn't seem
no.
healthy. That's a tangent though, but just the visual of that.
Sure. Well, okay, well, I can deal with it. But this is the thing. That's no different to, I guess, slavery, where certain you had the stud slave and so on who was there. His job was to actually impregnate some of the women on the I know, the plantation and so on. So it's like a form of breeding. You're controlling the nature of that group. In that case, it's dogs, and in my case, it would have been persons of color. So you're seeing them. There's an objectification of the other and a denial of their own right to exist as an entity without influence from humanity, if you like, or even within humanity, or even still out there, humanity even exists. And an attempt to control and assess their worth accordingly, which I think is, we started off joking about it. There is something a little darker underneath it, if you think about it a little bit.
Yeah, there absolutely is.
Probably why I don't watch, I just can't do it to myself. So,
Hmm.
mm.
I
That's a big
don't
conversation.
even know what to say after that. That's just like the more, I think that, I don't know. It's just the more, it's all even worse. History, as much as we know how horrible it has been for
Mm,
most people, it's even worse. It's even worse than people like want to admit or look
mm,
at.
mm, mm. Yeah, I agree with that, because I think there's also often an attempt to sanitize history and to make it all very palatable. Even, media is a great example of this, in films where, okay, historical films, which often miss out the darker psychological experiences of people, doesn't matter what the group is, just to present something which is more, I don't know, palatable, nice, fluffy. But then we all start to believe that facet of history as it's seen on the screen. Um, there was a massive uproar. What was the film? 1917, I think it was, the war movie, whereby I think there were a couple of people here in the UK who they weren't aware that there were Sikh soldiers who served in World War One as part of the sort of out of the colonies, and had assumed that what was seen on the film was a PC version of history, whereas actually what was on the film was a closer representation of the truth. Back to that we talked about earlier on. So that I think we teach something in schools which is very sanitized and denies the realities of the inhumanity, the inhumanity of man against other men, women, whoever, or minorities, whatever it might be, because that's part of history. Makes sense. I had to do a lot of digging around race, for example, in my outside of school, in my early 20s, when I was living in Germany, in the military, my military days, at US Air Force camps, strangely enough, interestingly enough, because they were the ones who sold books, about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and so on and stuff like that. And they were the ones where I felt most at home. So, and even that was flawed in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and I remember being taught in school, like you were talking about before, like, these are masculine traits and these are feminine
Mm,
traits. And
mhm,
and like I remember being taught that in school where they like had a list of like masculine is active, et cetera, and
mm,
women
mm,
is like passive, and
mhm.
like having like lists of it, all these like diagrams of things, and also like the men and then like the minorities and women, and it's like this perspective, this like cis male heterosexual white perspective is like
Yeah,
such a small fraction of the population, and it has somehow inserted itself as being like the dominant perspective and other like everything else besides it, and it's kind of
mm.
mind-boggling.
It is. I think you're quite right. It's such a small part of the population. I think the danger is in forgetting that's been going on for such a long time that it's very difficult, because we all drink that in some way. We all take on the idea that, okay, it's what it is to be a man, it's what it is to be a woman, it's what it is to be black or white or straight or gay, whatever it might be. and we enact that in some way. And there's a comfort in that. But until we start to wake up to, well, hang on, I don't like what I've become or what I'm not allowed to be, or why can't I be that? Or when we start to question these things, you don't have to think, you just have to be it when it's imposed upon you. When we start to think and challenge it, then either we're put back in our place, that can happen, or we strike out and find a group whereby we can be more ourselves, or what can also happen is we're just left on our own, and that can be quite difficult to then feel the level of loneliness that comes with trying to walk your own path, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think it's most disturbing, and why I'm glad that you so much wrote about this, like in psychology and counseling, because I find it extra disturbing that it's perpetuated in psychology, in schools and training, and in therapy itself, I guess, as well, because you would hope that that would at least be an area that is not perpetuating this, because you're supposed to be like exploring the mind and the unconscious and like all the facets of humans, rather than like continuing to put people in these boxes. But of course, like one side of psychotherapy is like all these labels and diagnoses and categorizations of people, what's healthy and what's normal and what's not.
Yeah, totally agree. You're quite right. We're so wedded to the safety of categorizations and so on that we stop questioning what that might be doing to our clients and so on, what it might mean for them. And I think that it feels like there's a return to curiosity that's coming up right now. There's to being able to be a bit more curious about these and risking getting stuff wrong or and so on with our clients. But I'm not one. It's one of those things. I don't mind if we're asking questions and not getting the right response, because at least we're exploring the material. And sometimes if in a good enough therapeutic or psychological relationship with our clients, there's room to actually co-create a meaning that actually resonates more for the client than it needs to for us. My fear is that I think you're quite right, that in our discomfort with not using the label, not being so wedded to the label, we just other our clients across the board, and they don't get the service that they deserve from us, ultimately. And that can happen. That can happen, is my sense.
Do you have any advice or anything to say to students that might be listening, that might be people of color or people that are struggling with these kinds of issues?
The simple point is this: be yourself. But I'm also very aware that being yourself can actually bring up lots of friction between yourself and the organization. So being yourself could be something that one explores in one's therapy. I would always do that, and to work out, okay, when is the right time to be oneself, and when is it more about pushing back because we're in a rebellious frame of mind or whatever it might be. That can happen. But the more authentic we can be, then the more of the change we can be within those training organizations. If I give for another piece of advice, find your support network. This is a difficult journey to undergo as a trainee or even as an experienced therapist or psychologist. But find your support network to take you through this. You don't have to do this on your own. You're going to find there are people who are alongside you who will be struggling with the same sorts of things, even if it's not the same sort of characteristics as yourself. There'll be those who will be struggling with being an outsider in some way. So track them down, walk alongside, is my view.
Yeah, and it is true that it's great that students nowadays have, podcasts like this and YouTube videos, and they can find more information and outside perspectives than just the ones in their schools or institutes. Because just, I was in grad school from 2002 to 2007, and then I did analytic training 2010 to 2013. And even just that long ago, there wasn't all of these resources. And there's just kind of like the school's perspective. And you also talk about there's not really diversity training. It's like when I was in school was like they had like multicultural lens, like look it through a multicultural lens, but it was still very like stereotyping, you know. And being
Exactly.
in Miami, it's like, okay, well, Haitian people, they have this in this their culture. So like if they believe in like talking to their grandparents, then it's okay. Don't, you know, send them to the hospital. They're not
Mm, mm,
pathological. And like, you know, this, but it was like all very much like stereotypes of different cultures
mm,
and not really an intersectional or kind of holistic view of people.
I think you're quite right. Yeah, it's been a more recent sort of development by being here. I trained around same time as you, and the 2 hours on difference and diversity in a 4-year course that I undertook was really poor. And also, yeah, but if you want one more piece of advice for any sort of students, find your political self. That'll be in there somewhere as well. To do the work around that, bring that in. Don't leave it outside.
Yeah, because really, I feel like this intersectionality should be much more central to training in general, and just looking
Mm-hmm.
at people as more complex and more, yeah, more multi-layered, and also thinking of this idea of like that you're going to have different feel differently in different situations. Just
Mm-hmm.
exploring these all these different aspects of how identity is kind of multi-layered, complicated, and constantly in flux. And
Mm-hmm.
how much people, other people's projections are really a part of it. Like, you know, it's so clear in some instances how much like people who are like staunchly anti-gay or anti-trans, it's like clear this is something about themselves, you know, that
Yeah,
they aren't dealing
yeah.
with, that they're just like going and attacking other people about. Otherwise, like why would you care what somebody's sexual orientation is? Like, what does that have to
Mm-hmm.
do with you? Why are you so against it, you know? And if people really need to also keep that in mind as well. People are really adamantly anti something, that probably says more about them than it does about you.
Totally agree. Yeah, I 100% agree with that. The number of stories I've heard about people who are anti-gay who then come out later on, it's become one of those sort of cliched stories, really, and we all just roll our eyes. Here we go again. It's yeah, it's it's sad and it's sickening because often they do a lot of damage along the way. In my sense, kind of eradicate it, which you can't change.
Yeah, and I feel like an intersectional approach also could
Mm,
help people who would get defensive, you know, maybe not be so defensive if you're like
sure.
coming to people. Not only is it true that this intersectionality, but also it's a great way to present to people so that they can feel like, okay, I also have aspects that I might feel othered and aspects where I'm
Mm,
privileged, rather
mm,
than it being like
mm,
one or the other.
mm.
People
Totally
can
agree.
hear that more.
Yeah, I think we need to explore that more. We're very, because the political sphere has narrowed down what it is to be the other. What this does is actually take this, like you said, it makes it way more complex. It actually brings in those experiences. Let's say from childhood, being marginalized because you're too short or because you've got red hair. These are things which are not uncommon for kids, and it can leave a real scar within in one's psyche that needs to be healed. But also can be a great route to if you can empathize with that part of that wounded part of ourselves, then you're sort of on the road to empathize with somebody else's experience of being an outsider as well. Um, so I think, yeah, one of the aims that I have, hopefully, for the future, is that courses then start to take this more holistic exploration around intersectional difference and not just try and tick box it off as part of a course somewhere.
Right, like you said, like not have it just be these categories that are
Yeah,
from like certain political acts or things that have
yeah,
been put into law, but things that are much more multifaceted.
yeah. And I think some of the founding fathers of psychology and psychotherapy, they did lots of this work ages ago. This is nothing new, but it somewhere got lost. Don't know how would have happened. It needs to come back here. Is my view.
Yeah, it is kind of bringing it back to where it began, but in a much more, yeah, multifaceted and useful way.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
also, I feel like the epitome of the problem was like ego psychology, when it became something where you're supposed to identify with the ego of the analyst and internalize that. That's like very, yeah, white male cis
Yeah, yeah.
kind of peak for
I think,
analytical work.
I think you're quite right on that score. Yeah, which then sets up a whole. Yeah, it normalizes white male. Yeah, white male says, yeah, I can't add anything more. There is no chance of being anything different than that therapist in that moment. That's quite this, and that still exists in some ways to this day.
Yeah, my training analyst was like that.
Ah,
I had to have another analysis after my training analysis to undo the damage from my training analysis, because I was just like, I don't want to integrate you.
you be yourself.
No, thank
God, isn't it
you.
strange? Yeah. Oh,
So it still exists, so that's for sure.
yeah. Sadly, yeah, yeah. Well, I think hopefully in a generation or two that will have, well, not died away, become more marginalized. But yeah, we'll see. We'll see. Podcasts like this help. Put it that way.
I think so. I wish I had this podcast when I was in training.
Same here. Same here. But like you said, there was nothing out there. And I love that I get to recommend podcasts to students now and say, well, if you listen to your podcast or whatever it might be, listening in life or whatever podcasts are out there, to have a listen to alternative contemporary views around psychology and psychotherapy. There's a wealth of material in there, which is great stuff.
Yeah, and I try to have other podcast hosts on to introduce people to other podcasts. And I had someone recently say, like, I'd like to start my own podcast. I'm like, please do. Like, I
Mm-hmm.
love that there's so much material out there for students. Is there anything else that you wanted to mention before we wrap up? Do you have anything coming up or anything like that?
Well, I am as always. Well, you know me. I'm always on Twitter doing something daft. So, so I'm always tweeting something. I think there's going to be a number of good talks and presentations coming up in the autumn into early next year around an intersectional approach to difference and otherness. So please follow me on Twitter and the D Turner. Was it at D Turner 300? I think it is. There's my website. If you hear this podcast and want to subscribe to my website, then please do, because I do a regular newsletter about 4 times a year. There'll be papers. Yeah, I can't stop writing. There's, I
In your
have a lot to say.
blog?
I know there'll always be stuff that I've got to write about, so there'll be things you can follow me on there. But please, yeah, get in touch if ever you need, if ever I can be of assistance in any way. Always a pleasure.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Absolute pleasure, as always, to come back and talk to you. So, brilliant.
Thank you for listening to Rendering Unconscious. You've just heard a discussion with Dr. Dwight Turner. Be sure to check out his new book, Mockingbird: Intersections of Privilege and Otherness in Counselling and Psychotherapy, from Routledge 2021. You can check out his website, dwightturnercounseling.co.uk, and follow him at Instagram and Twitter at dturner300. You can also listen to our previous conversation, Rendering Unconscious, episode number 95. You can visit my website, drvanessasinclair.net, or the podcast main website, renderingunconscious.org, for links and more information. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram at rawsin_. That's RAWSIN_. And now, follow my voice for Hatshepsut, from the album of the same name, a collaboration between myself and Per Olund, available at Highbrow Lowlife's Bandcamp page. That's highbrowlowlife.bandcamp.com. Enjoy. Every day that I was in Egypt, I saw the sun rise and set. Every single day. If I could travel anywhere, I would travel everywhere with you. One endless trip with occasional stops to assemble the documentation. We make art of what we experience, and as what we experience is interpreted by us as art, we have come to inhabit a zone that is creatively ultra conducive to new
ideas and experiences, and then we make art of those too. Tell me a secret. Tell me a story. One of your life, because I want you to connect with me. Follow my voice. Use your ears to see, your eyes to ingest, and your hands to feel. I'm going to show you a few things, and I need you to really see them. Things aren't always what they seem here, so you have to be prepared. I am an animist, artist, and author who works with remnants of the dead and the discarded to create talismanic and totemic art, like aspirin or something, for the headache of life. Yes, there is a kind of humor here, which is not bad. It might even be the announcement of a period when humor would be introduced, when people would not be so serious and money would not be so important, and there would be time for leisure with you.